Pause for a moment and look at the date on your screen. Every appointment you note, every new year you celebrate, acknowledges the existence of a man who divided time itself. His shadow stretches across 21 centuries, raising cathedrals, justifying wars, and inspiring sublime art. Yet here begins the mystery. This absolute center of Western civilization left no written words, no palaces, no monuments from his life. To the Roman Empire, he was an insignificant troublemaker from a forgotten province, a peasant who died on the most humiliating execution device of antiquity. Tonight we leave sermons behind and enter the cold, fascinating terrain of evidence. We will place Jesus of Nazareth in the dock of history. Was he a man of flesh and blood who walked the dusty roads of Galilee, the most brilliantly constructed myth of all time? The answer is stranger and more complex than any school or church lesson. We will dive into Roman archives that survived fire and time, unearth desert stones that contradict centuries of tradition, and analyze the words of ancient historians who hated Christians yet left us the most valuable clues. This is not merely a documentary, but a monumental investigation. It will shake the foundations of what you know. From the real face archaeology returns to the historical Jesus far from European paintings of fair skin and blue eyes, to the political intrigues between high priests and Roman governors that sealed his fate. Believer, atheist or agnostic, this is a journey to the heart of an enigma that defines who we are today. When all the pieces of this 2,000-year puzzle are assembled, the final picture will resemble nothing you expected. Welcome to the definitive search for the man behind the icon. Imagine trying to trace the most famous person alive today. We would have gigabytes of video, thousands of photographs. Now, rewind 2,000 years and search for the man who shaped every corner of our culture. We encounter the first, most disconcerting paradox. An individual with billions of modern followers is a ghost in the official records of his own time. To Roman bureaucrats, Jesus was background noise, a Galilean peasant in a troubled region, warranting perhaps a few lines in a lost execution report. While Emperor Tiberius had statues, coins, and paid chroniclers, this itinerant preacher left no direct material trace, no letter, no inscription, no object we can touch and say with certainty passed through his hands. This total disconnect forces a fundamental distinction: the Jesus of faith versus the Jesus of history. The Jesus of faith is the all-powerful Son of God, who walks on water. The Jesus of history is the man of flesh and blood who sweated under the Middle Eastern sun, felt hunger, and spoke Aramaic with a rural accent that sophisticated Jerusalemites looked down upon. The historical Jesus is the subject researchers try to rescue, peeling back centuries of theological varnish like restoring an ancient painting, revealing a more austere human portrait underneath. For many, this human version is almost unrecognizable, as it shatters all the visual schemas sold to us for centuries. Close your eyes and picture Jesus. You likely see a tall man with fair skin, a perfectly trimmed beard. This image, from European cathedrals to Hollywood, is perhaps one of history's greatest aesthetic marketing operations. A Eurocentric design, the historical and biological reality is completely different. A man who lived in first-century Palestine, worked outdoors, and descended from Semitic lineages, would hardly look like a Swedish model. Here enters the fascinating work of forensic artist Richard Nave. In the early Tarsus century, using craniofacial reconstruction techniques, they analyzed skulls of Jewish men from Jesus' era and region to create an average face. The result demolished centuries of traditional iconography. The face proposed by science shows a man with dark, weather-beaten skin, a broad nose, strong features, and, crucially, short, curly hair, as Jewish customs of the time dictated. This was not the slender, ethereal man of Renaissance paintings, but someone who would look perfectly normal walking through a market in Iraq or Syria today. This demolition of the traditional image is not merely an aesthetic detail, it is a declaration of principles. To find the real man, we must first let the blonde icon smiling from calendars die, and accept that historical truth is often more earthly, rough, and paradoxically more fascinating than fiction allowed us to imagine. We are about to enter a world of dust, politics, and rebellion. To understand why this man ended up hanging on a crossbeam, we must first understand the hornet's nest he entered. Judea in the 1st century was not a spiritual haven, but the ancient equivalent of a powder keg with a very short fuse. This geopolitical chaos has a brutal turning point in 4 BCE with the death of Herod the Great. Imagine Herod as a mix between a brilliant architect and a horror movie villain. He rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem with blinding magnificence, yet was so paranoid he ordered the execution of his own wife and several sons, fearing they would steal his throne. It was said then that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son, for he at least wouldn't eat. When this nightmare monarch finally exhaled his last breath, his kingdom crumbled. His territory was split like a mismanaged inheritance among his 3 sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. None had their father's iron fist. Archelaus, who got the worst part, proved so incompetent and cruel that the Jews who hated Romans sent a delegation to Emperor Augustus begging for his removal. Rome never won to miss an opportunity to intervene where taxes were involved, accepted the invitation. Thus, in 6 CE, Judea ceased to be a client kingdom and officially became a second-class Roman province. Here, the system of prefectures changed the rules of the game. Unlike rich, tranquil provinces like Egypt or Gaul, governed by high-ranking senators, Judea was considered a punishment, posting a dusty place full of stubborn people who refused to worship the empire's gods. Therefore, Rome sent prefects, not refined politicians, but career military men from the Ordo Equestor, the upper middle class of the Roman militia. These prefects did not live in chaotic Jerusalem, where the smell of animal sacrifice and religious hostility turned their stomach. They preferred the comfort of Caesarea Maritima, a city on the Mediterranean with theaters, hippodromes, and all the comforts a civilized Roman needed to avoid feeling at the end of the world. The administration operated on a simple, ruthless logic. Keep the peace and ensure money flowed to Rome. The prefect held the power of life and death, the ius gladii, the right of the sword. This meant that although the Jews had their own laws and religious trials, only the Roman could give the final order for execution. The system was one of constant friction. Imagine a Roman soldier, raised in a culture that worshipped strength and imagery, trying to govern a people who believed placing a statue of the emperor in a building was an unforgivable sin. Roman administration in Judea sought not conversion, but order, maintained through suffocating taxation that pushed peasants like Jesus to despair. Every coin for Caesar was one taken from a Jewish child's plate. This economic tension meant any preacher speaking of a new kingdom was seen as a direct threat to the imperial machine, crushing them. Rome ruled by fear, and the prefect was the hand holding the whip, ready to strike at the slightest hint of sedition. Thus, the stage was set. A wounded people, a puppet ruling class, and a Roman boot pressing down, creating the perfect tinder for a spark. The temple in Jerusalem was not a place of silent meditation. It was the combustion engine of Judea, a terrifying mix of stock exchange, central bank, and the ancient world's largest slaughterhouse. Imagine the constant smoke of sacrifices, blood in designed channels, and the deafening noise of haggling. It held an absolute monopoly, as it was the only place Jews could perform sacrifices. Religion and finance intertwined scandalously. The temple tax, required annually from every Jewish male worldwide, made its treasury one of the empire's largest capital reserves. But you couldn't pay with Roman coins bearing blasphemous images. You had to use changers to get Tyrian shekels for a hefty fee. This is the real context behind Jesus overturning the tables, an attack on the financial heart, propping up Jerusalem's elite. The temple was also the political center. The high priest was both a religious leader and the official representative to the Roman governor. He had to be holy enough for the people, yet submissive enough for Rome. To assert control, the Romans kept the priestly vestments locked in the Antonia fortress, loaning them only for major festivals. Under this pressure, Judaism was a battlefield of factions. The Sadducees were the aristocratic, pragmatic collaborators who ran the temple. They were religious conservative, thus accepting only the first 5 books of the Bible, and denying an afterlife. Their goal was to maintain privilege and the status quo. Opposing them were the Pharisees, popular with common people. They believed in resurrection and an oral law adapting commandments to daily life, obsessed with ritual purity, so every Jew could live like a priest. Their conflict with Jesus stemmed from his more flexible interpretation of the law, which they saw as spiritually dangerous. On the margins were the Essenes, who believed the entire system was corrupt. They retreated to the desert, like at Qumran, living in chastity, constant ritual baths, and an obsessive wait for the worlds. And the apocalyptic monks, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then came the Zealots, who added blood to the cocktail. For them, God was the only king, and paying taxes to Rome was idolatry. Within this faction were the Sicarii, named for the short dagger, the Psyche, hidden under their cloaks. They would blend into festival crowds, assassinate a Jewish collaborator or Roman official, then melt away by crying out in false horror, a constant climate of urban terrorism. Into this world of corrupt elites, legalistic teachers, hermit monks, and guerrilla daggermen walked a preacher from Galilee. He spoke of a kingdom not of this world, yet his words threatened every group's interests. Jesus did not walk through an empty desert, but through an ideological war zone. We now reach a critical point, leaving religious texts for the cold, cynical archives of the Roman imperial administration. To know if someone truly existed, we ask what his enemies said. Enter Cornelius Tacitus, considered by many the empire's greatest and most reliable chronicler. A senator of the elite, he held absolute contempt for anything outside traditional Roman order. Around 116 AD, while writing his monumental annals. Tacitus needed to explain an event decades prior, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Emperor Nero, facing rumors he himself ordered the fire, desperately needed a scapegoat. That group was the Christians. Tacitus writes of them with palpable disgust, calling their practices abominations. But within this festival of insults, he delivers a crown jewel for history. He writes textually that the group's name derives from one Christus, who, during the reign of Tiberius, was handed over for torture by the procurator Pontius Pilate. This is a sledgehammer to any theory that Jesus was a total invention centuries later. First, Tacitus is a hostile witness. He is not trying to convert anyone. He calls Christianity a destructive superstition and a mischief originating in Judea. When a historian who hates a movement confirms its founder, era, and execution, it is golden proof. Tacitus had access to official Senate documents and imperial archives. He was recording a technical datum to explain the origin of a troublesome sect. Critics note, Tacitus uses procurator for Pilate, while archaeology shows his correct title was prefect. But by 116 AD, the official title for governors in that region had changed to procurator. Tacitus used the term. His contemporary readers understood. It is akin to a modern historian saying an ancient nation's president made a decision, though the title was different then. The central historical fact remains. Tacitus confirms, unwillingly and with contempt, that Jesus was not an abstract idea or a mythical sun god, but a man of flesh and blood executed under the authority of Rome's most important man in Judea, during the reign of the world's most powerful man, Tiberius. It is not a story of faith, but a damage report from a Roman bureaucrat who unknowingly signed the historical birth certificate of the man he sought to erase from imperial memory. What was a footnote about a criminal executed in a dusty province became one of the most solid pillars for reconstructing the truth about the Nazarene. Tacitus was the serious, stiff historian of the Roman elite. Our next witness, Caiaphas Suetonius, was more like the empire's great chronicler of bedroom secrets. Writing around 120 AD, Suetonius had a near-magnetic fascination for salacious details and imperial gossip. As secretary to Emperor Hadrian, he had direct access to imperial archives, including police reports and now-lost records. In his famous The Lives of the 12 Caesars, Suetonius offers a short, almost offhand comment that has kept historians working for centuries. Speaking of Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD, Suetonius mentions that this emperor expelled Jews from Rome because they were constantly causing disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. At first glance, one might say this has nothing to do with our man from Nazareth. The name appears as Chrestus, not Chrestus. But here, philology and Roman police history become interesting. In the Greek and Latin of the time, Christus and Chrestus were pronounced very similarly. The name Christus was common among Roman slaves, meaning useful to an official. Hearing disputes over Chrestus sounded like brawling over a common slave name. This error is monumental because of its date, 49 AD, merely 15 years after Jesus' execution. Suetonius records the explosive conflict when Jesus' followers reached Roman synagogues, preaching a crucified Messiah. The chaos in Jewish quarters grew so severe that Emperor Claudius expelled them all. This misspelling is paradoxically authentic. A later Christian forger would have written Christ perfectly. The error proves Suetonius consulted a genuine Roman report, unaware of who Jesus was, but knowing his name caused riots. This confirms Jesus was not a slow-cooked legend, but a figure whose memory provoked police disturbances in the world's capital within a generation, a historical shockwave traveling Roman roads faster than emperors could control. From Rome, we travel to Bithynia in 112 AD, where Governor Pliny the Younger writes to Emperor Trajan. This is not a chronicle, but a real administrative letter. Pliny confesses a problem. The Christian plague spreads everywhere. Pagan temples stand empty. To investigate, he tortures 2 slave women, deaconesses, expecting confessions of atrocious crimes like rumored cannibalism. What he discovers leaves him perplexed by its simplicity. He reports Christians gather before dawn, singing hymns to Christ as to a god, a staggering phrase from a disinterested pagan. They take an oath not to commit theft, adultery, or fraud, pledging to be exemplary citizens. They share ordinary food, disproving cannibal rumors. Pliny sees them not as dangerous criminals, but as adherents of a contagious, eccentric superstition. Trajan replies not to hunt them proactively, but to punish those who refuse to worship Roman gods. This exchange captures the movement's transformation from a Jewish sect to a transcultural phenomenon threatening pagan sacrifice economies. Within 80 years of Jesus' death, communities had hierarchical structure, a divine focus on Jesus, and an ethics that astonished Romans. Pliny wanted an administrative solution for a cult problem. He left the first sociological report on early Christianity. Now imagine a dusty cell in northern Syria around 73 AD. Mara bar Serapion, a Stoic philosopher, writes to his son, "This is not an official report, but a father's advice." He asks what the Athenians gained by killing Socrates, or the Samians by burning Pythagoras. Then he launches his dart. What advantage did the Jews gain by executing their wise king? For from that very moment their kingdom was taken away. His logic is one of poetic justice. Socrates lives in Plato's works. Pythagoras lives in his statue. This wise king lives in the new laws he enacted. Mara is not Christian. His mindset is purely pagan. To him, Jesus is not a resurrected God, but a brilliant philosopher king whose death triggered national tragedy, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The connection between this leader's execution and the nation's fall proves the event was etched in collective memory as a point of no return. By the late 1st century, Jesus' teachings were seen as a solid system of life, comparable to sophisticated Greek schools of thought. This Syrian father offers a view stripped of incense and miracles. Jesus was perceived as an intellectual monarch whose physical elimination could not stop his ideas. It is one of the earliest, most disinterested testimonies that in Judea existed a man called a king, whose wisdom amazed even Stoics, and whose death was seen as a cataclysmic historical error. This is not a conversion narrative, but a cultured man recognizing the indelible mark the Nazarene left on history, long before Christianity became any empire's official faith. In the year 93 AD, a man published his masterwork, Jewish Antiquities, a 20-volume history aimed at Roman intellectuals. He sought to prove the Jews were not barbaric newcomers, but a people with a lineage and wisdom that dwarfed Greek traditions. Within this sea of historical data names of kings and endless genealogies was a brief paragraph that has ignited more academic fire than almost any other ancient text, the famous Testimonium Flavianum. In this passage, Josephus supposedly writes that around that time lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one might call him a man, who performed miracles, was the Christ, and after being executed by Pilate, appeared alive on the third day as the prophets had foretold. At first glance, it seems the definitive proof, the archived record that ends the debate. But here is where suspicion and detective analysis enter. Josephus was a proud Pharisee who lived and died as one. If he truly believed Jesus was the Messiah, resurrected, he would not have been a Roman-protected chronicler, but a persecuted Christian. It is utterly impossible for a non-believing Jew to write phrases like, "If indeed one might call him a man," or "he was the Christ." What occurred here is what historians call an interpolation, or more plainly, a creative edit. For centuries, the men tasked with hand-copying Josephus' books were Christian monks. Imagine one such monk in a medieval monastery, reading Josephus' text and thinking it disrespectful for so important a historian to mention Jesus so coldly. The temptation was too great. They decided to help Josephus be more pious, sliding these theological phrases between his original words. This created a gigantic problem. For a long time, critics argued that since the text was clearly manipulated, the entire paragraph was a total invention by the Church, and that Josephus never mentioned Jesus. However, modern historical science has advanced to a more subtle and fascinating position. Most experts are now convinced that beneath that layer of Christian paint hides an authentic original core. To find it, historians performed a kind of chemical cleaning of the text, removing the parts that sound too Christian and leaving what sounds like Josephus style. What remains is a much drier, more realistic account. Josephus likely wrote that a man named Jesus lived, a teacher who attracted many Jews and Greeks, who was condemned to the cross by Pilate following an accusation from Jewish leaders, and that his followers did not abandon their affection for him after his death. This purified Josephus is far more valuable than the retouched version, for it gives us the view of an independent historian who, while not believing Jesus was God, confirms his existence, his role as a teacher, and his official execution. The fact Josephus mentions Jesus amid a list of other misfortunes and disturbances of the era fits perfectly with his style of narrating Judea's history as one tragedy after another. In the end, the medieval copyists' attempt to exaggerate Jesus' figure cast a shadow of doubt over the text. But modern dissection has managed to rescue the voice of that Jewish general who, amidst palace intrigues and the echo of a destroyed nation, left a record that a Galilean preacher had truly walked that land. Yet, if you thought the mystery ended with medieval monks meddling in Greek texts, prepare for a plot twist worthy of an international spy film. For centuries, historians fought over a paragraph that seemed too perfect to be true. Then, in 1971, an Israeli scholar named Shlomo Pines decided to look in a completely different direction, the 4th century Arab world. There, he unearthed a jewel that changed the board completely. It was the work of a Christian bishop and historian named Agapius of Hierapolis. In a corner of his Arabic Universal History, he cited Josephus' famous passage about Jesus, but what Pines found was not the embellished version everyone knew. It was something much rawer, more honest, and therefore far more credible historically. What makes Agapios' version so important is its almost surgical neutrality. Researchers were stunned to read a text that, instead of stating he was the Messiah, simply said he was thought to be the Messiah, a subtle but gigantic difference. In Agapios' Arabic version, the phrases smelling of incense and church dogma vanish completely. It does not say Jesus was more than a man, nor does it bluntly affirm he rose on the third day as a proven fact. Instead, Agapios' text narrates that the disciples reported these appearances and that his movement continued despite the crucifixion. It is as if we found an original recording of a famous song before producers added so many sound effects. It became unrecognizable. This discovery was an academic earthquake. It suggested an original version of Josephus' works circulated in the Arab world, spared from the corrections of European Christian scribes. Agapios was not a simple translator, but a bridge in time, using sources likely lost today. By citing Josephus with such sobriety, he returns to us the authentic voice of the first-century Jewish general. In this version, Jesus is presented as a teacher of great wisdom and exemplary conduct, whose death resulted from an official condemnation by Pontius Pilate. But all the mystical paraphernalia that strips historical weight from the account is omitted. It is proof Josephus did write about Jesus, but did so as what he was, a historian recording the facts of a turbulent province, not a convert trying to preach a new religion. Venturing into these branches of Arabic history teaches us that truth is not always on the most visible shelves of our Western libraries. Sometimes, to find the trace of a man who lived in Judea, you must follow the path of translations that cross deserts and linguistic borders. Agapios' text restored dignity to Josephus' testimony, rescuing it from the claws of forgery suspicion, and giving us a solid basis to say that by the end of the 1st century, a Jewish historian with access to imperial sources considered Jesus' existence a fact worthy of recording in his people's memory. It is a victory of research over manipulation, reminding us that sooner or later, original words find a way to come to light even 1,000 years later, and in a completely different language. If the Testimonium Flavianum is the battlefield where historians and theologians clash with everything they have, there exists another passage in Josephus' work that is far more discreet, almost boring. Yet, for modern historical science, is an even more demolishing proof that Jesus was a real figure. We speak of an event in the year 62 AD, a moment of power vacuum in Judea that allows us a fleeting glimpse of the Nazarene's flesh and blood family. The Roman governor Festus had just died, and his replacement was still en route from Rome. In this political gap, the high priest Ananias the Younger, a member of the Sadducee caste, known for his arrogance and heavy hand, decided it was the perfect time to settle scores without Roman interference. Ananias convened the Sanhedrin and brought to trial a man named James, whom many of you will know as James the Just, but Josephus does not present him with pompous titles or halos of sainthood. He identifies him in the most mundane, administrative way possible. He calls him the brother of Jesus, the one who is called Christ. This small detail is what makes historians' eyes light up. Here, Jesus is not the story's protagonist. He is simply the reference point to identify the person Josephus is actually interested in at that moment. In the ancient world, If you wanted someone to know who you were talking about in a legal record, you identified them by their family. The fact Josephus mentions James as the brother of Jesus tells us two fundamental things. First, that Jesus' existence was such an accepted and known fact in the Jerusalem of that time that it served as identification for other members of his family. And second, that the community Jesus left behind was not an abstract legend, but a group led by his own biological relatives. We may wander a moment into the thicket of family relations this implies for later traditions. For centuries, it has been debated whether this James was a full brother, a half-brother, or a cousin. But for Josephus, writing in Greek and perfectly familiar with Jewish customs, the word he uses leaves little semantic doubt. He sees a direct kinship. Yet, beyond the theological quarrel over Mary's virginity, what matters here is politics. Ananias ordered James and other Christians to be stoned, but it backfired. The more law-abiding citizens of Jerusalem were so outraged by this illegal trial that they complained to the new Roman governor and King Herod Agrippa II, succeeding in having the high priest deposed. This episode gifts us golden proof because it is incidental testimony. Josephus is not trying to prove Jesus existed. He is trying to illustrate how corrupt and impetuous high priest Ananias was. It is precisely because Jesus is mentioned in passing, almost as paperwork, to identify the condemned, that experts trust this text's authenticity so deeply. There is no trace of Christian retouching here, only the dry chronicle of a Jewish historian recording a legal dispute between priests and the relatives of a preacher executed decades prior. It is an unfiltered window into a Jerusalem where the brothers of Jesus still walked the streets, led communities, and sometimes paid with their lives the price of carrying a surname that the Romans and Jewish elite preferred to forget. We are not before a mystical tale, but before the confirmation that Jesus left a genealogical footprint so real that even his enemies had to record it in their judicial acts. To understand why historians are convinced of these events' reality, we must speak of a man who was likely more famous and feared in his time than Jesus himself, John the Baptist. In the Gospels, John appears as a supporting actor, a precursor whose sole purpose is to prepare the way, baptize the protagonist, and then exit tragically. Yet, when we turn to Flavius Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, we find a profound surprise. Josephus dedicates considerably more space to John than to Jesus, offering a mine of historical objectivity. He presents John not as a secondary figure, but as a political and religious leader of the first order in Perea and Galilee, man of extraordinary goodness, who urged Jews toward justice and piety. For Josephus, John's baptism was not a magical forgiveness of sins, but a symbol of bodily purification, provided the soul was already purified through righteous conduct. This gives us a more human, philosophical profile. The motive for his death is where the accounts diverge sharply. The biblical narrative tells of a seductive dance and a vengeful mother, a story of betrayal and eroticism. Josephus, the cold historian, provides a more pragmatic, political version. Herod Antipas ordered John's death out of fear. John's massive following and absolute influence over the people terrified Antipas, who believed such eloquence could spark a large-scale rebellion, threatening his throne and his relationship with Rome. There was no impulsive promise, only a cold political calculation. John was arrested, sent to the grim fortress of Machaerus near the Dead Sea, and executed. Josephus further links John's death to a real military disaster. Antipas' divorce from the daughter of King Aretas IV of the Nabateans led to a war where Antipas' army was destroyed. The Jewish people of the time, Josephus records, believed this defeat was divine punishment for Herod's murder of the righteous John. This shows how deeply John's figure was etched into society, shaping the interpretation of geopolitical events. This is fundamental for proving Jesus' existence. Through a compelling historical logic, Josephus mentions John the Baptist entirely independently of Jesus. In his section on John, he does not even mention the Nazarene. This confirms John was a real historical figure with his own career, movement, and end documented by non-Christian sources, since the Gospels, our primary source on Jesus, inextricably link their lives. The historicity of one inevitably reinforces the other. Furthermore, historians point to the criterion of embarrassment. If the early Christians had invented Jesus' story, they would never have invented his baptism by John, because in the ancient world, the baptizer is superior to the baptized. This fact was so uncomfortable for the early church that it spent centuries explaining why the Son of God submitted to John's ritual. The independent existence of John the Baptist in Josephus' text is the anchor preventing Jesus' narrative from drifting into legend. By confirming John was a flesh and blood man who made kings nervous, Josephus proves the stage upon which Jesus began his mission was as real as the dust on sandals and the intrigues of palaces. If written history is sometimes a swampy terrain where authors mix prejudice with fact, archaeology is the definitive reality check. Stones do not care what you believe. They simply lie buried under layers of dust and oblivion, waiting for someone with a brush and patience to return them to the light, to refute or confirm centuries of theory. For a long time, the fiercest critics of the biblical narrative held a seemingly solid argument. If Pontius Pilate was so relevant as to decide the fate of a man who would change the world, why was there no trace of him in the archaeological record? To many, Pilate was merely a literary invention, a cardboard villain created to give a legal framework to Jesus' death. All that was shattered in 1961 in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima. An Italian team, excavating the Roman theater, there stumbled upon a block of limestone that later builders had reused in the most humiliating way possible, placed face down as a mere step. Imagine the researchers' faces when they turned over that slab and discovered a Latin inscription time had not fully erased. There, carved into the stone, appeared the words that silenced decades of skepticism: Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. This find, known today as the Pilate Stone, not only confirmed the man existed and was exactly where the Gospels said, but also offered a fascinating historical correction. While chroniclers, like Tacitus, later called him a procurator, this stone, carved while Pilate still breathed and wielded power, tells us his official technical title was Prefect, a detail that seems minor but grants brutal authenticity to the historical context of the Roman occupation in Jesus' time. The stone was part of a dedication to a building called the Tiberium. It is a delicious irony of history that the name of the man who tried to wash his hands to avoid being recorded as responsible for an execution ended up forever engraved in the same material used to build theater steps. But if you believe a giant rock is the only clue this governor left, consider the case of the bronze ring in the Igulatines. During excavations at Herodium, that spectacular, volcano-shaped fortress Herod the Great built near Bethlehem, a rather modest copper alloy ring was found. For 50 years, this piece sat in a laboratory drawer, covered in a crust of corrosion that made it seem a trivial trinket. It was not until 2018 that a team used advanced photography and digital cleaning techniques to see what lay beneath 2 millennia of grime. What they found left the scientific community astounded. The ring shows the image of a wine vessel, a crater, surrounded by a Greek inscription that clearly and directly states of Pilate. Now, we must be realistic and apply the critical mastery we always discuss. It is highly unlikely Pontius Pilate, a Roman aristocrat with access to gold and the empire's finest jewels, would wear such a simple bronze ring. Experts believe this is a seal ring used by someone in his administration, perhaps a secretary or low-ranking official, with the authority to sign documents or seal shipments in the prefect's name. What makes this find truly powerful is that it demonstrates Pilate's name was not only on the great marble monuments of Caesarea, but circulated on the everyday objects of the Judean administration. The ring was found in a place that functioned as a logistical center for Roman government, reinforcing that Pilate was not a legendary character, but a very real bureaucrat, with a staff using his name to get things done. These two finds, separated by decades but united by the same figure, are like pieces of a puzzle, forcing us to accept that the political stage upon which Jesus moved was inhabited by people of flesh, bone, and bronze rings. Leaving a material trace the soil of Israel refused to hide forever. Archaeology does not preach, but when it strikes with the truth of a stone inscription or a metal seal, its voice resonates with a force no theoretical argument can ignore. The archaeologists entered to find 12 limestone ossuaries. One stood out, exquisitely carved with rosettes, a luxury only the highest family could afford. On its side, a roughly scratched inscription read, "Joseph bar Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas." Inside were the bones of a man about 60, a woman, and 4 children. After 2 millennia of theological debate, we were likely looking at the remains of the high priest who, according to tradition, interrogated Jesus. Historians like Josephus confirm the high priest's full name was Joseph Caiaphas, and this opulent ossuary in a family tomb fits the profile of a man who held the highest religious office in Judea from 18 to 36 AD under Pontius Pilate. If the ossuary speaks of his death, the ruins of Jerusalem's upper city tell of his life. Opulence. Excavations reveal urban palaces up to 600 square meters, decorated with frescoes and mosaics in the latest Roman fashion. These elite Sadducee families lived in brutal contrast to the peasants who brought their few coins to the temple. Private mikvaot, ritual purification pools with carved stone steps, were built within their homes. They used expensive Jerusalem stoneware, valued because stone could not become ritually impure. This was a command center for a corporation managing temple money, seeing any popular profit as a direct threat to their financial stability. The conflict with Jesus was not abstract. It was a frontal clash between an impoverished periphery and an immensely rich, sophisticated center of power, utterly unwilling to cede its privileges. For decades, a favored argument against Jesus' historicity was that Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century. Modern excavations in Nazareth's heart have delivered a reality check. In 2009, archaeologists found the remains of a 1st century house, a humble dwelling with 2 rooms, a courtyard, a cistern, and fragments of limestone vessels, the mark of an observant Jewish family. Under the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, archaeologist Ken Dark has studied a house partially carved into bedrock from Jesus' time. By the 4th century, a church was built over it, indicating local tradition remembered it as sacred. Nazareth was not a city. It was a village of perhaps 400 people, a backwater of peasants and artisans living in caves and dry stone houses, so irrelevant to Rome that its greatest historical merit was remaining unnoticed for centuries. If Nazareth was the childhood home, Capernaum was the headquarters of Jesus' public life. There, amid black basalt ruins, stands a 5th century octagonal church built over a much older house. Beneath its floor, archaeologists found a 1st century insula, a complex of humble dwellings. One room received special treatment. Its floor was plastered and replastered, its walls covered in early graffiti in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. The prayers invoke Christ and repeatedly name Peter. We see a clear evolution. A common fisherman's house became a domus ecclesia, a house church, and later, the site of a monumental basilica. There is no logical reason for a poor fishing community to preserve and venerate one specific room, unless it belonged to someone foundational to their story, like Simon Peter. This is the fossil record of a devotion that began just years after the crucifixion, evidence that Jesus and his disciples were not ethereal figures, but men who left soot on walls, mended nets, and shared meals in small rooms we can still touch today. We now enter the most electrifying and divisive terrain, where deep faith collides with high-tech microscopes. 2 objects, if proven entirely authentic, would be the genetic code of Jesus' history. The first is the Shroud of Turin. Imagine a linen sheet over 4 meters long, bearing the faint, yellowish, negative image of a man tortured and crucified, with surgical precision matching the Passion accounts. Its modern history pivoted in 1898, when amateur photographer Secondo Pia took its first photograph. In his dark room, viewing the negative, he nearly dropped the glass plate. What he saw was not a shapeless stain, but a serene human face of startling clarity. Invisible to the naked eye, the shroud ceased to be a medieval relic and became an epic scientific problem. The bombshell came in 1988. The church allowed 3 prestigious labs in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona to perform radiocarbon dating. The results were a blow. The cloth was dated between 1260 and 1390 AD. Official science declared it a magnificent medieval forgery. Yet this only ignited a war among researchers that continues. Many scientists and syndenologists argue the sample came from a corner repaired by nuns after a fire, mixing old and new fibers. Pollen analysis by botanists like Max Frey revealed traces of plants growing only around Jerusalem and Turkey, suggesting the cloth traveled the east long before appearing in Europe. Most perplexing is the image itself. It is not paint or dye. It is a superficial, acidic dehydration of the linen fibers, containing three-dimensional information. For a medieval forger to create this, they would have needed knowledge of photography and radiation. While carbon-14 says one thing, the physics of the image screams another, leaving the Shroud in a fascinating limbo, where science still cannot explain how that human negative formed. If the Shroud is the enigma of cloth, the James Ossuary is the enigma of stone. In 2002, archaeology paused with the announcement of a limestone bone box inscribed, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." It was like finding a first-century business card linking the three central figures of Christianity's origin, but the excitement was short-lived. The Israel Antiquities Authority seized the artifact and accused its owner, collector Oded Golan, of forging the Brother of Jesus inscription to inflate its value. Dubbed the James Bond of Antiquities by the press, Golan faced a monumental 7-year trial in Jerusalem, involving hundreds of geology, linguistics, and microscopy experts. The debate centered on patina, the biological crust formed on stone over centuries. Government experts argued the inscription was recently carved and coated with a chalk-water mixture to appear ancient. Independent scientists, however, found traces of ancient natural patina within the very grooves of the controversial letters. The trial concluded in 2012 with a bittersweet verdict. Golan was acquitted of forgery charges because the state could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the inscription was fake, but this did not automatically mean it was authentic. Today, Ossuary remains under fierce scrutiny. If real, it would be the first physical trace directly and contemporaneously mentioning Jesus of Nazareth, buried in a family tomb in Jerusalem. If fake, it is the most brilliant fraud in archaeological history. These two artifacts, the Shroud of Turin and the James Ossuary, act as mirrors to our own curiosity. They show that even as scientific techniques advance to science fiction levels, some corners of history resist being fully illuminated, leaving us in that uncertain space where material evidence and unanswered questions intertwine, keeping alive the mystery of the man behind the myth. We leave behind stone and metal to enter the laboratory of linguists and word detectives. To understand the man who walked through Galilee, we must learn to read between the lines and listen for the echoes of a nearly vanished language. The Gospels that reached us are written in ancient Greek, the cultured, commercial language of the era. But Jesus did not speak Greek in his daily life. He spoke Aramaic, a vibrant, earthy Semitic tongue. When historians analyze the texts, they search for what they call Aramaisms, small phrases or words trapped in the original Greek like fossils in amber. Phrases like Talitha koum, meaning little girl, I say to you, arise, or the anguished cry from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? These are not literary ornaments. They are the shipwrecked remnant. Even the word Abba, which Christians solemnly translate as Father, carries in Aramaic a charge of shocking intimacy, closer to Daddy or Papa. This reveals a way of relating to the divine that was utterly revolutionary and strange for the Judaism of his time. What efficient avamo utraliural to Judy in a Trian data. But the search does not stop at isolated words. Researchers have spent decades trying to solve the puzzle of how the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written. Comparing these texts, which are so similar, they can be read in parallel columns. Experts reached a fascinating conclusion. All seem to have drawn from a common source, now lost. This source is called the Q document, from the German word Quell, meaning source. Q is believed to have been a collection of logia sayings of Jesus written very shortly after his death. Imagine an instruction manual containing the teacher's most potent phrases, with no miracles or passion narratives, just his pure teachings. Though we have no physical copy of Q, its shadow falls on every page of the Gospels, allowing us to reconstruct the Nazarene's original message before it was interpreted by later theology. This quest for the primary source lets us say that behind the narrative lies a real historical voice, a style of speaking filled with paradox, sharp humor, and a peasant wisdom impossible to invent from nothing by a committee of writers. To separate reality from myth, historians use precision tools called criteria of authenticity, the most devastating of which is the criterion of embarrassment. This criterion states a logical point. If a community is inventing a divine superhero to gain followers, it would not invent stories that are humiliating or difficult to explain. For instance, the fact that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. In the ancient world, the one who baptizes is superior to the baptized. For the early church, this was a theological headache. Why would the Son of God submit to the ritual of a lesser prophet? If the story were an invention, they would have erased this episode or changed it so that John knelt before Jesus. The fact that they kept it, despite its discomfort, is proof the event occurred and was so widely known it could not be erased. The same applies to the crucifixion. Dying hung on wood was Rome's most infamous punishment, reserved for slaves and traitors. It was a death that provoked disgust and shame. Inventing that the world's savior died in the most pathetic way possible is religious marketing suicide. If Christianity survived the shame of the cross, it is because the cross was a historical reality they could not ignore. To this we add the criterion of multiple attestation. It is not just one author saying something, it is many saying it from different angles. We have Paul of Tarsus writing letters barely 20 years after the events. We have the Gospels, we have Flavius Josephus, and we have the oral traditions circulating through the empire. When sources that do not know each other, or are even enemies, agree on the same basic points that Jesus was from Galilee, that he was a charismatic teacher, and that he was executed under Pontius Pilate, the probability that the figure is an invention falls to zero. Furthermore, there is historical coherence. The Jesus emerging from these studies fits perfectly into the marginal Judaism of the first century. His parables about mustard seeds, peasant debts, and wedding banquets are sharp portraits of rural life in Galilee. He does not speak like a Greek philosopher or a Jerusalem priest. He speaks as someone who knows hunger, hard work, and the weight of Roman taxes. And speaking of hard work, we come to the point that completely humanizes the figure, his profession. For centuries we have been told Jesus was a carpenter. But the original Greek word is tekton, and its meaning is much broader and rougher than we imagine. A tekton was a construction artisan, someone who worked with wood, yes, but also with stone and metal. In a Galilee, where wood was a scarce and expensive resource, Jesus likely spent more time quarrying stone or building walls than making tables. Being a tekton in a subsistence economy meant belonging to a very specific social class. He was not a slave, but neither was he a peasant who owned his own land. He was a day laborer, someone who depended on construction projects in nearby cities to eat. It is very likely that the young Jesus and his father Joseph walked each morning the 6 kilometers separating the village of Nazareth from the great Roman city of Sepphoris, which was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas with insulting luxury. There, Jesus would have seen with his own eyes the brutal contrast between the opulence of Roman villas with their mosaics and theaters and the misery of his neighbors dying from debt. Being a Tecton put him in contact with the outside world, with the Greek spoken on construction sites, and with the corruption of political power. This life experience as a construction worker is fundamental to understanding his later message. When Jesus speaks of not building a house on sand, or of the builders rejecting the cornerstone, he is not using pretty metaphors he read in a book. He is speaking of his trade, of the scars on his hands, and the stone dust in his lungs. The historical Jesus is not a mystic who descended from the clouds. He is a man hardened by the sun in the quarries of Galilee, a worker who knew perfectly well how the world of power functioned from its foundations, and who decided that system could not stand. We now arrive at one of the spiciest debates, raising blisters in both theology faculties and ancient history departments. For centuries, tradition has sold us the image of an almost ethereal Jesus, a kind of meditation teacher walking through fields speaking of lilies and little birds, totally removed from the violence and mud of the politics of his time. But if we put on the lenses of critical history and look at the context of occupied Judea, that image begins to crack. There is a question floating in the air that is extremely uncomfortable for many. What if the man from Nazareth was not just a spiritual leader, but someone the Romans perceived as a dangerous revolutionary ringleader? To answer this, one need not speculate with conspiracy theories. One need only open an ancient Greek dictionary and look carefully at who his cellmates were in his final hours. We all remember the crucifixion scene with a man on each side of Jesus. Most Bibles you have read simply call them thieves. In our minds, we imagine 2 poor fellows who perhaps stole a couple of chickens or a bag of coins at the market, and who, by a bad twist of fate, ended up on the cross. But here is where translation plays a monumental trick on us. The original Greek word used in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew to describe these men is lestai. And if we asked an inhabitant of the time what a lestens was, they would not say it was a petty pickpocket. In the Roman world, and especially in the writings of Flavius Josephus, the term lestai was used to designate bandits, guerrillas, and political insurgents operating in rural areas. They were not common thieves. They were what we would today call terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on which side you view it from. They were men who lived in caves, who ambushed Roman caravans, and who were convinced that the only way to purify the land of Israel was through the blood of the foreign occupiers. The fact that Jesus was executed alongside 2 lestai is a historical datum that should make us jump from our chairs. Rome did not waste wood, nails, and the valuable time of its soldiers to execute common thieves. For robbery crimes, the Roman legal system had much simpler punishments, like flogging or fines. Crucifixion was the maximum penalty and was reserved almost exclusively for 2 types of people: rebellious slaves and those guilty of sedition or treason against the state. By hanging Jesus between 2 guerrillas, the administration of Pontius Pilate was sending a very clear visual message to the entire population gathered for Passover in Jerusalem. They were not punishing him for a matter of religion, or for whether he got along with the Pharisees. He was being executed as the leader of a mobilization that, in the eyes of Roman intelligence, had the marks of armed insurgency. In the Galilee, where Jesus grew up, social banditry was a daily reality. The tax burden was so crushing that many peasants lost their lands and had no choice but to take to the hills with a knife. These lesti were seen by the people as heroes defying the empire. If Jesus spoke of a new kingdom to come, a kingdom that would displace the powers of this world, to a Roman soldier that did not sound like mystical poetry, it sounded like a declaration of war. The line separating an apocalyptic prophet from a guerrilla leader was exceedingly thin in the first century. This perspective does not mean Jesus was assaulting fortresses with a sword, but it forces us to understand his message carried an explosive political charge that placed him in the same legal category as the most violent rebels of his generation. The cross was not the end of a misunderstood philosopher, but the sentence of a state that allowed no one, not even a craftsman with powerful words, to question the absolute order of Rome's boot. If the presence of guerrillas on the crosses beside him hinted at the climate of violence surrounding Jesus' execution, what we find within his own inner circle is, to say the least, a scandal for those seeking a teacher of absolute peace. Among the 12 apostles appears a figure often overlooked, but whose name is a battle cry: Simon, the Zealot. In first-century Judea, being a zealot was not simply religious enthusiasm. The Zealots were the most radical, violent, and militarized faction of Judaism, men who believed any Jew paying taxes to Rome was a traitor, and that God's kingdom would only come through armed force. Some researchers even suggest the name Judas Iscariot may derive from Sicarius, the assassins who hid daggers under their cloaks to stab Romans in crowds. Imagine the political impact of a spiritual leader walking the provinces surrounded by men linked to armed resistance movements. It is as if a modern social activist surrounded himself with known members of an insurgent guerrilla group. However much the leader spoke of peace, state intelligence would watch him every hour. But the moment this political tension erupts occurs in the darkness of the Garden of Gethsemane, just before the arrest. According to Luke, Jesus tells his disciples that whoever has no sword should sell his cloak and buy one. When they reply they have 2 swords, he says it is enough. Why would a group of itinerant preachers, supposedly speaking only of love and forgiveness, carry short swords under their tunics? Some theologians soften this, saying they were for defense against wild animals. But in the context of Jerusalem at Passover, with the city ready to explode and thousands of Roman soldiers watching from the Antonia fortress, carrying a weapon was a declaration of intent. The situation becomes starkly real when the patrol arrives to arrest him. It was not a quiet arrest. There was armed resistance. Peter, the fisherman who always acted before thinking, draws one of those swords and cuts off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. This act, however small, is technically an attack on constituted authority, an act of outright rebellion. Although Jesus orders the fight stopped, the fact his group was armed and willing to use force was the final nail in his coffin. For the Romans, this was not a theological dispute about the Sabbath or food purity. It was confirmation they were dealing with an insurgent cell that, however small, had the capacity to start a revolt at the most dangerous time of the year. To close the circle on the political facet of the execution, we must look up, just above the head of the man nailed to the beam. There the Roman soldiers, fixed a small wooden tablet coated with white plaster, an inscription that has passed into posterity as the acronym INRI. In Roman law, this was the titulus, not an ornament or a gesture of piety, but a strictly bureaucratic legal requirement. Its function was to inform every passerby exactly what crime the condemned had committed to deserve such an atrocious punishment. It was, in essence, a public warning. If you do what this man did, you will end up like him. According to accounts, Pontius Pilate ordered the inscription drafted in 3 languages: Hebrew or Aramaic, the local tongue of the rebels; Greek, the language of commerce and culture; and Latin, the official language of imperial law and power. This linguistic trinity ensured absolutely no one in cosmopolitan Passover Jerusalem could plead ignorance. What that tablet said was brief, but to Roman ears it was the equivalent of an explosion. Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. This is not a religious or mystical title. It is the indictment for a political crime of the utmost gravity, known in the Roman Code as crimen lese majestatis, the crime of treason. In the world of Tiberius Caesar, there was no greater sin. Only the emperor had the authority to name kings or grant titles of sovereignty. For a Galilean peasant, without Rome's permission, and surrounded by enthusiastic followers, to proclaim himself or allow himself to be proclaimed King of the Jews was a direct and brazen challenge to Rome's absolute sovereignty. Pilate, in writing this, was not recognizing Jesus' divinity. He was protecting his own neck before the emperor, documenting that he had eliminated a pretender to the throne who threatened imperial peace. There is a detail of delicious political irony here. The leaders of the Sanhedrin, seeing the placard, were deeply offended and asked Pilate to change the text to not write that he was the king, but that he had said, "I am the King of the Jews." Pilate's response, dry and cutting as a whip, was, "What I have written, I have written." With this phrase, the prefect was not only showing his contempt for the Jewish priest's complaints, but was using Jesus to humiliate the local elite. By hanging a broken, agonizing man under the title King of the Jews, Pilate was telling all Jerusalem's inhabitants that this was all they could expect if they kept dreaming of independence or of liberating messiahs. The titulus is perhaps the most solid historical proof that Jesus was executed under a secular political charge. He did not die for blasphemy, because for Romans blasphemy against a foreign god was a matter of no importance. He died for treason, for being a man who, with his words about a new kingdom, dared to question that the only owner of the world was the man sitting on the throne in Rome. Even beyond the tablet, the soldiers' mockery during the torture reinforces this. They placed a purple cloak on him, the color exclusive to royalty and triumphant generals, and pressed a crown of thorns onto his head. The entire ritual of the Passion was a cruel parody of a Roman coronation ceremony. The soldiers were not mocking his theology. They were mocking his political pretensions. For the Roman system, Jesus was a bloody joke, a physical reminder that in the empire of the Caesars, there was room for only one sovereign. What we see today as a symbol of sacred sacrifice was, for a first-century inhabitant, the evidence of a state sentence for the gravest crime one could commit against the established order. If you seek the exact moment Jesus' death sentence became inevitable, do not look to his sermons on love or his miraculous healings. Look to the crash of overturned tables and the sound of coins rolling across the marble of the Jerusalem temple. To understand the magnitude, discard the idea, he entered a small neighborhood chapel and got angry with a couple of candle sellers. The temple was a massive complex, the largest building in the Jewish world. And what Jesus did was attack its logistical and financial center at the year's busiest time, Passover. Imagine the chaos. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the Roman Empire arrived, and by religious law, all had to buy animals for sacrifice and pay the temple tax with a specific coin, the Tyrian shekel, because Roman coins bore the emperor's image and were considered idolatrous. The money changers and animal sellers were not simple merchants. They were official concessionaires working under the direct wing of High Priest Caiaphas' family. It was a lucrative business, a money-making machine that leveraged the faith of the poorest to fill the coffers of the priestly elite. When Jesus enters the court of the Gentiles, the only place non-Jews could be, he encounters this large-scale market. In overturning the money changers' tables and knocking down the stalls of those selling doves, the offering of the poor, who could not afford a lamb, he was not having a simple fit of religious anger. He was performing what in antiquity was called a prophetic act, a symbolic protest with real economic consequences. By interrupting the flow of money and the commerce of sacrifices, Jesus was saying the entire system was corrupt and the temple no longer fulfilled its function of connecting people to God, but had become a barrier. Most interesting is the phrase the accounts put in his mouth, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Here linguistics delivers another slap of historical reality. The word for thieves in the original Greek is, once again, the same root as lestai, which we saw refers to insurgents and guerrillas. By calling the temple a den of guerrillas or insurgents, Jesus was making an exceedingly dangerous wordplay. The temple authorities, it was whispered, were as violent and exploitative as the mountain bandits, or worse, a caste betraying their people's essence. This act was the point of no return. For the priestly elite, it was a terrorist attack on their revenue and a public challenge before thousands. But the gravest matter was the gaze of Rome. From the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple, Pontius Pilate's soldiers watched the festival crowds. During Passover, Jerusalem was a pressure cooker. Any temple disturbance was a national security threat. By causing this chaos, Jesus became a target. He was no longer a strange preacher from distant Galilee, but an agitator who had dared to touch the pockets of the powerful and shatter peace in the province's most volatile holy site. From this moment, the coalition between the Sanhedrin and Roman power agreed on one fundamental point: that man could not live to see the week's end. It was not his theology that led him to the cross that Friday. It was his audacity to challenge Jerusalem's economic and political monopoly in its own home. To understand the trial, we must see Joseph Caiaphas not as a cartoon villain hating spirituality, but as the coldest, most pragmatic politician in all Judea. Being high priest in the first century meant being the lightning rod for an entire nation. Caiaphas was the bridge between a Jewish people on the brink of armed rebellion and a Roman Empire with zero patience for religious unrest. If things spiraled out of control, it was the Jewish people, their temple, and their institutions that would pay the price. Caiaphas held his position from 18 AD to 36 AD, an absolute historical anomaly. In an era where Roman governors changed high priests like sandals to demonstrate power. His 18-year survival tells us he was a master of survival, an exceptional diplomat who knew exactly which strings to pull in the governor's palace. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem mobilizing the masses, for Caiaphas, the problem was not theological. It was national security. Passover swelled the city's population threefold, with nationalist fervor at its peak. Caiaphas knew. Pilate watched from the Antonia, troops ready to descend upon the crowd at the slightest hint of sedition. His reasoning, recorded even in religious texts with astonishing political bluntness, was that it was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. It was not a matter of justice or truth, but of political arithmetic. For the high priest, Jesus was an acceptable risk, a piece to be sacrificed on the board to prevent Roman legions from putting thousands to the sword and erasing Jerusalem from the map decades before it finally happened. This calculation reveals the tragedy of ancient realpolitik. He did not see a prophet. He saw an element of instability that could give Pilate the perfect excuse for military intervention in the temple. Caiaphas' family, especially his father-in-law, Annas, the true power in the shadows, had built an economic and social empire based on the stability provided by their pact with Rome. Jesus, by attacking the temple markets and proclaiming himself king, was unilaterally breaking that pact. The trial before the Sanhedrin, therefore, was less a just judicial process and more a crisis cabinet meeting. They sought not truth, but a charge solid enough for the Romans to do the dirty work. Caiaphas needed to present Jesus to Pilate, not as a Jewish blasphemer, something Rome cared nothing about, but as a claimant to the throne, challenging Caesar's sovereignty. In this high priest's mind, handing over Jesus was the necessary price to buy another year of peace and survival for the temple. It was a political sacrifice by a man who understood that in the game of empires, the survival of the institution always outweighs the life of any individual, however charismatic. The character most victimized by centuries of image cleansing is Pontius Pilate. Popular iconography, Holy Week processions, and Hollywood present a tormented man, an intellectual Roman doubting, seeking legal reasons to free Jesus, finally yielding, almost with regret, under unbearable pressure from a bloodthirsty Jewish MOBA, nearly tragic bureaucrat, trapped in a moral dilemma, washing his hands in desperation. Yet, when we set aside sacred texts and delve into the chronicles of historians who actually knew him or lived in his time, like Philo of Alexandria or Flavius Josephus, a radically different, darker figure emerges. The historical Pilate was not a hesitant man, prone to philosophical reflection, but a ruler of methodical, inflexible cruelty who enjoyed provoking his subjects and governed with an iron boot. Philo describes him with words leaving no room for imagination, shattering any attempt to sanctify his memory. He speaks of his venality, his arrogant character, and most gravely, his habit of executing people without any trial. For Philo, Pilate's administration in Judea was summed up in one word: oppression. Historical records show incidents proving this man had zero respect for local customs and seemed to seek conflict deliberately. Shortly after taking office, he ordered Roman legions to enter Jerusalem under cover of night, carrying imperial standards bearing the emperor's image. For Jews, this was unforgivable idolatry within the holy city. When a massive crowd surrounded his palace in Caesarea for 5 days and nights in protest, Pilate lured them to the hippodrome, surrounded them with soldiers, and threatened to cut them all down. He only stopped when he saw the Jews were willing to offer their necks rather than accept the images. A man willing to order a massacre of unarmed civilians over a handful of standards is not, by any historical logic, the type to spend hours debating the nature of truth with a detained Galilean peasant. Another incident revealing his true face was the conflict over Jerusalem's aqueduct. Pilate decided the city needed better water infrastructure, a necessary project, but financed it by confiscating money from the Korban, the temple's sacred treasury. When people took to the streets to protest what they considered sacrilegious theft, Pilate did not seek dialogue or show doubt. He sent his soldiers disguised as civilians into the crowd, armed with clubs and daggers hidden under their robes, and at his signal they began an indiscriminate slaughter that left Jerusalem's ground covered in corpses. This is the true Pontius Pilate, a pragmatic military man who saw human life as entirely disposable if it served to maintain Roman order or demonstrate who was in command. So we must ask why the Gospels present him as someone who repeatedly tried to save Jesus. Here we must apply historical analysis, mastery, and understand the context in which those texts were written. Most Christian accounts that have reached us were composed or finalized after 70 AD, the year Rome definitively crushed the Great Jewish Rebellion, destroying Jerusalem and burning the temple to its foundations. In that post-apocalyptic world, the first Christians desperately needed to prove their movement was not a threat to the Roman Empire, to avoid being persecuted like the Jewish rebels. If they presented a Roman governor as the absolute villain and sole responsible for their Messiah's death, they were putting a noose around their own necks before imperial authorities. A solution was a narrative political maneuver, shifting the weight of blame for the execution from Roman authority to Jewish authorities. By softening Pilate's figure and showing him as a man who found no fault in Jesus, the authors sent a message to Rome saying Christianity was compatible with the imperial order and the true culprits were those Jews who had just rebelled against Caesar. In the historical reality of that Passover Friday, the encounter between Jesus and Pilate likely lasted mere minutes of bureaucratic procedure. Pilate needed no long trial or complicated witness proofs. Before him was a man accused of being the king of the Jews in a city that was a powder keg ready to explode. For a Roman prefect, there was no possible moral dilemma or existential anguish. Crucifixion was the automatic, efficient response to any suspicion of political sedition. Pilate did not wash his hands, due to conscience scruples or a premonitory dream from his wife. If he made any gesture of disinterest, it was as a show of supreme contempt toward the Sanhedrin leaders, making clear to them that he held the absolute power to kill or save, but that the province's stability was above any individual peasant's life. The image of the hesitant Pilate is a literary construction necessary for the Church's survival in its first centuries. But cold history and archaeological remains return us to an iron soldier who did not hesitate a second to nail a Nazarene to a cross to ensure the Roman peace remained undisturbed during the festivals. To visualize the tension breathed in Jerusalem during Jesus' final days, we must lift our gaze above the temple walls and fix it on a threatening gray stone mass that seemed to watch the city's every sigh, the Antonia fortress. Built by Herod the Great and named for his protector Mark Antony. This edifice was not just a military barracks, it was the physical, brutal symbol that Judea was not a free nation, but an occupied province. Strategically located at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, the Antonia loomed over the sacred enclosure like a hawk over its prey. From its 4 towers, the tallest, nearly 25 meters high, Roman soldiers had a panoramic, direct view into the temple courtyards. From the towers of the Antonia fortress, Roman soldiers watched the sacred temple courts below. They observed every entry and exit, vigilant for any gathering crowd or the impassioned voice of a Galilean preacher. This was a bitter irony for the Jews, performing their most holy rites under the contemptuous gaze of a centurion, his armor gleaming in the sun. For most of the year, Rome's presence in Jerusalem was minimal, a single cohort stationed there while the legions enjoyed the coastal comfort of Caesarea. But Passover changed everything. The city's population swelled from 40,000 to several 100,000 in mere days. Jerusalem became a human hive, packed with pilgrims celebrating their ancient liberation from Egyptian bondage. The Romans were acutely aware of the parallel in occupied peoples celebrating freedom under their noses. Thus, surveillance became suffocating. Prefect Pontius Pilate would journey from Caesarea with massive reinforcements, doubling the garrison. Secret passageways connected the fortress directly to the temple porticos, allowing soldiers to flood the courtyard at the first sign of revolt. Spies for the Sanhedrin and Roman informants mixed with the crowds, listening for whispers of zealots and hidden daggers. This was not a place for spiritual peace, but a cold war zone where a single shout could unleash a massacre. It is within this context of absolute militarization that we must place the arrest and execution of Jesus. When Roman soldiers moved from the Antonia to arrest him or to guard his path to Golgotha, they were not enacting a divine plan, but a state security protocol. To a legionary on those stone towers, Jesus was merely a speck in the human tide of the temple, a minor nuisance to be removed before discontent spread. His fate was sealed under the shadow of those battlements, in air thick with the smoke of sacrifices and the scent of legionary leather and steel. We now turn to one of history's most iconic, theatrical, and historically improbable gestures: Pontius Pilate washing his hands before a crowd, declaring himself innocent of the blood of a just man. This image is seared into our culture as the universal symbol of evading responsibility. Yet, examined under the lens of Roman law and political reality, a profound contradiction emerges. This ritual of hand-washing to cleanse guilt is absent from all Roman legal custom. However, in the Torah, specifically Deuteronomy, we find an almost identical rite prescribed for elders when an unsolved murder occurs. The washing of hands is a purely Jewish legal figure. The notion that a Roman prefect, a man known for his arrogance and disdain for local superstitions, would employ a Jewish legal technicality to communicate with a mob is logically and historically nonsensical. Why then does this account feature so prominently? The answer lies in the world. After 70 AD, Jerusalem lay in smoldering ruins. The temple was destroyed, and the early Christians, still seen as a Jewish sect, were in a perilous position. To openly state that Rome executed their leader as a political rebel would make them enemies of the state. But if the Roman representative, Pilate, was portrayed as attempting to save Jesus, pressured by the Jewish leaders, then Christianity ceased to be a threat to the emperor. The hand-washing is almost certainly a literary and theological device of astonishing political genius. It used a symbol any Jewish reader would understand as a declaration of innocence, while shifting the blame for the cross from the Roman boot to the hands of the Sanhedrin and the people of Jerusalem. This narrative maneuver was vital for the religion's survival and expansion within the empire, but it bore a terrifying human cost. From it sprang the dangerous phrase, "His blood be on us and on our children," used for centuries to justify persecution, ignoring the historical truth that no one died on a Roman cross without a Roman deciding it for reasons of state. The historical Pilate needed no bowl of water. His conscience operated under the laws of power and efficiency. Jesus was merely another entry on that week's execution list, a necessary transaction to ensure Passover ended without riot. The bowl is a later addition, a powerful visual metaphor crafted to soften the blow of history and allow justice's message to survive in a world ruled by Caesars. To truly understand Jesus, one must sometimes leave the gardens of Galilee and enter the blistering silence of the Judean desert. Here, in the mid-Arsith century, the most important archaeological find of the modern era occurred. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Edib, searching for a lost goat, threw a stone into a cave near Qumran and heard the sound of breaking pottery. What he found were not treasures of gold, but clay jars containing hundreds of manuscripts, sealed by dust and dryness for 2,000 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was the library of a radical Jewish sect known as the Essenes, spiritual preparationists, who believed the world was corrupt and the end of days was near. This dispels a great internet myth. Jesus was not an Essene. The Essenes were obsessive about purity, bathing ritually, and shunning sinners, while Jesus ate with tax collectors, touched lepers, and surrounded himself with the impure. Yet the connection is undeniable. Jesus and the authors of these scrolls breathed the same intellectual air, used the same apocalyptic language, and shared the same hatred for the priestly elite in Jerusalem. Reading the Qumran manuscripts reveals the boiling cauldron of ideas in which Christianity was born, the coming of a Messiah, a final war between the sons of light and darkness, and the establishment of a new covenant. One stunning document, Seculand Ibasislo, the Son of God fragment, written decades before Jesus' birth, uses titles like Son of God and Son of the Most High for a future messianic figure. This shows Jesus did not invent these concepts, but employed terminology already circulating in Judea's radical atmosphere. Even the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount find an almost literal echo in Qumran texts, speaking of the poor in spirit and those who hunger for righteousness. The Essenes were desert warrior monks, living in community, sharing all things, awaiting a Messiah who would be both king and perfect priest. The Dead Sea Scrolls gift us the lost context of Jesus. They show he was not a solitary voice crying in the wilderness, but part of an explosion of religious and social fervor sweeping the province. Qumran reflects what many Jews hoped for, a liberation both spiritual and political. Studying these texts, we understand that Jesus' insistence on the kingdom of God was not an abstract idea of heaven, but a concrete proposal that resonated powerfully with a people reading these very scrolls in secret, dreaming of the day Rome's chains would be shattered forever. The desert was not empty, but filled with visions, prophets, and a literature of resistance that prepared the ground for the message from Galilee to spread like wildfire. In December 1945, near Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad Ali struck a fearful of a spirit. He broke it open to find 13 leather-bound papyrus codices. Tragically, his mother used some of these priceless pages to kindle her oven fire. What survived was a theological earthquake, the Gnostic texts. For the Gnostics, salvation came not from belief in crucifixion, but from gnosis and inner, mystical revelation. They saw the material world as a flawed creation by an inferior deity. The crown jewel of the find was the Gospel of Thomas, not a narrative, but 114 sayings. Here, Jesus is a wisdom teacher, a provocateur, who points not to himself, but to the divine spark within. One saying declares, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." Another claims, "The divine is present in a split piece of wood or an upturned stone." This breaks the idea of God confined to a temple. Many historians ponder if Thomas preserves an earlier independent tradition, reflecting a chaotic, vibrant explosion of early interpretations. Some followers saw Jesus as a purely spiritual being, others as an enlightened man. The Nag Hammadi Library whispers of a Jesus of internal wisdom, whose powerful and complex figure generated opposing worldviews buried in the sands for millennia. We then confront the great narrative gap, 18 silent years between Jesus' childhood and his baptism. This void has bred wild theories. The first stop is Egypt, a center of Hermetic knowledge. An early critic, Celsus, claimed Jesus worked there as a laborer, learning magical arts to later proclaim himself divine. Yet no archaeological evidence supports an extended stay. More fanciful is the Indian hypothesis, sparked in 1894 by a Russian journalist who claimed to find a manuscript in a Himalayan monastery describing Isa studying Buddhist laws. Investigators later found the story was a complete fabrication. Such theories often reveal more about our desire for exotic answers. The most probable historical explanation is terrestrial. Jesus likely remained in Nazareth, working as an artisan, traveling to work sites, caring for his widowed mother, and living the hard life of a peasant under oppressive taxes. Ancient biographies cared little for the uneventful youth of a provincial laborer. The man who emerged at 30 was forged in the dust of the workshop, his character shaped by witnessing injustice from below. The very absence of records paradoxically affirms his humble origin. For a forgotten village worker, history saw nothing to tell until he began to speak. Finally, we face the mythicist question. What if the figure is a literary construction? This is not a modern internet theory, but has roots in the 12th century with scholars like Bruno Bauer, who argued the first gospel was a literary allegory invented to give identity to a new community. Today, thinkers like Richard Carrier employ statistical tools to argue it is more probable Jesus began as a purely celestial figure, a spiritual entity whose sacrifice occurred on a mystical plane, later given an earthly biography. They note that in Paul's letters, the earliest Christian writings, almost no details of a human life are mentioned. This perspective challenges us to consider the powerful process by which a profound symbol can be woven into the fabric of history. The silence of Paul, who speaks not of parables, miracles, or the earthly life of Jesus, is for some a proof that the earliest Christians knew only a spiritual vision. Another pillar of the mythicist view, popular in mass media, is the comparison to solar myths and ancient dying and rising gods. We wander into comparative mythology, to ask if Jesus is a mere retelling of Horace, Mithras, or Dionysius, arguing for a virgin birth on December Arsawuth, 12 disciples, and a resurrection after 3 days. This astrotheology suggests Christianity is merely a repackaged sun cult, where the solstice sun dies for 3 days and is reborn. Yet, when we scratch the surface, the paint falls away. Most professional historians, including atheists and agnostics, consider these parallels exaggerations or pure inventions. No ancient Egyptian text describes Horus born of a virgin with 12 disciples. Mithras was born from a rock. These claims often rely on outdated Tuhaddaz Satri scholarship, while Christianity later adopted dates like December Arsawuth to compete with pagan festivals. This does not make the founder mythical. So, why do nearly all serious historians, from conservative to secular, accept a historical Jesus? The answer is an overwhelming academic consensus. A scholar like the openly atheist Bart Ehrman argues it is impossible to explain Christianity's explosive rise without a real founder. If Jesus were a pagan sun myth, his first followers would not have been Palestinian Jews, a people deeply resistant to foreign gods. Furthermore, the criterion of embarrassment applies. No one invents a Messiah executed in the most humiliating way by an occupying army. A victorious solar god is not depicted dying a slave's death. The consensus holds it is far harder to explain how Jesus was invented from nothing than to accept a charismatic preacher whose followers, after his death, interpreted his life through myth and theology. For history, Jesus' existence is as probable as that of Socrates. We have more early sources about him than many Roman emperors. Mythicism, while fascinating for casual debate, collapses under cross-examination, cultural context, and the logic of religious evolution. Jesus was adorned with legend, but the wood beneath that icon was a real man who sweated, spoke, and died in a dusty Roman province. To understand how this Jewish artisan's message became a world religion, we must examine a profound transformation. The chief architect was not an original apostle, but a man who never met Jesus, Saul of Tarsus, known as Paul, a diaspora Jew, Pharisee, Roman citizen, and Hellenistic thinker. Paul moved seamlessly between synagogues and Greek marketplaces. He cared little for the historical Jesus parables. For him, only the cosmic event of the death and resurrection mattered. He made the audacious theological move to break Christianity from traditional Judaism, declaring circumcision and dietary laws unnecessary for Gentile converts. This removed a major barrier, transforming a Jewish national liberator into the universal Kyrios title, used for gods and emperors. Jesus' message shed much of its Jewish social resistance, becoming a mystical, universalist call for personal salvation that resonated across the empire. But if Paul laid the ideological foundations, a traumatic event forced the gospel writers to change the script. The Great Jewish Revolt, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, with the temple burned and thousands slain, the world changed. In this atmosphere of suspicion toward all things Jewish, the early Christians realized that to survive they must distance themselves from looking like a Judean rebel sect. When evangelists like Matthew, Luke, and John wrote their final versions of Jesus' life, they had a clear political agenda: to absolve Rome of blame. Thus was born the image of a hesitant Pontius Pilate, with the guilt for the crucifixion shifted onto the Jewish people. Christianity, could now present itself as a peaceful, spiritual faith, no threat to imperial authority. The final transformation, sealing the fate of the West, occurred nearly 3 centuries later in Nicaea. By 325 AD, Emperor Constantine faced an empire fracturing from civil wars and invasions. He saw Christianity as a unifying social force, but Christians were bitterly divided over technicalities. Was Jesus equal to the Father, or a created being? Constantine, a pragmatic politician, convened the First Great Council to impose order. He wanted a unified religion as glue for his state. At Nicaea, the dogma was fixed. Jesus was declared God from God, light from light, of one substance with the Father. In that hall, surrounded by imperial guards, the Galilean artisan was fully absorbed into the Christ of imperial glory. The books that would form the Bible were defined. Others presenting different, more human visions of the teacher were burned. The process begun by Paul, accelerated by Jerusalem's destruction, culminated here. The man executed by the system had become the sacred heart of the system itself. After this journey through time, inscriptions, and rescued parchments, we face a mountain of evidence. The figure of Jesus of Nazareth is not floating in mythological vacuum, but anchored in historical soil. From the Roman historian Tacitus, who mentions a Christus executed under Pontius Pilate, to the recovered testimony of Flavius Josephus, and the Aramaic echoes within the Gospels, the documentary trail is dense and coherent. Archaeology adds its voice. The Pilate Stone at Caesarea, the ossuaries of the Caiaphas family, the humble house remains in Nazareth, and the early worship structure in Peter's house at Capernaum. These speak of a movement that left material traces long before it became an imperial religion. What remains truly impossible for historical science is to explain the explosive rise of Christianity without a central figure who caused a seismic impact on his contemporaries. There is no logical way a group of Jewish peasants and fishermen, within a culture expecting a triumphant warrior Messiah, would invent a leader whose days ended in the most shameful, pathetic manner possible for that time, nailed to a Roman cross. The existence of the historical Jesus is the only piece that makes the first-century puzzle fit completely. Had he been merely a solar myth or literary allegory, his message would have dissolved into Gnostic mists or died with Jerusalem. But the force of his personality and the radical nature of his teachings were so potent, they survived the trauma of execution and state persecution, forever transforming the course of human civilization. Yet, as we close this investigation, a reflection remains like an open wound in the memory of the West. The man who truly walked the shores of the Sea of Galilee, that artisan with hands calloused from rough construction, skin darkened by the relentless eastern sun, and deeply Semitic features, has long been lost beneath layers of dogmatic theology and European art. For centuries, art has presented a Jesus of fair skin and blue eyes, a figure more suited to Roman salons than the dusty villages of Judea. We have transformed the revolutionary who unsettled priests and governors into a static, distant icon. To recover the historical Jesus is an act of justice toward the past. It is to understand that behind the stained glass existed a man who spoke an earthly language, knew hunger, challenged the economic corruption of his time, and paid the highest price for daring to dream of a different world. He who left not a single written line ended up writing the history of the last 2 millennia with the force of his presence. Ultimately, the historical Jesus compels us to look beyond personal belief and recognize that in an insignificant corner of the Roman Empire, someone with the hands of a laborer and a voice laden with hope changed the course of the world forever, leaving a mark that time has never fully erased.